The national web of roads, bridges, railways and telegraph cables, which the Vogel administrations had so greatly extended in the 1870s, had not on the whole encompassed Maori communities unless they were located close to European areas of settlement. And conditions in those communities varied enormously from district to district and from hapu to hapu, so much so that it is difficult to generalize about Maori life in the later years of the 19th century. One reason is that the basis of this life remained whanau, extended family, and hapu. Maori generally did not view themselves as Maori, a single race and culture, even after the word Maori had come into common usage from about halfway through the 19th century. Consequently, there was little incentive for them to behave in a uniform way, other than to continue, in characteristically tribal fashion, to disparage and compete with Maori from other hapu and other places. The very persistence of tribal feeling had worked against the continuation of nationalist experiments such as the kingitanga, though the kingitanga survived largely as the responsibility of Tainui tribes. Persistence of tribal feeling as the very essence of Maori identity prevented Maori from acting as a pressure group commensurate with their numbers. Even though 4 specifically Maori seats were created in the National Parliament in 1867, extending the franchise to all Maori men, tribalism and regionalism prevented the members from acting in concert to promote common Maori objectives, as did the fact that most of those early Maori MPs were not proficient in English, and few Pākehā members spoke Maori. Despite such diversity, most Europeans, unless they had married into Maori families, rarely distinguished one Maori from another or one tribe from another, a fact especially evident in cartoons of Maori of the period. Maori was simply native in official language. Those of part Maori descent were almost always identified exclusively with that side if their features or colouring were even slightly Polynesian in character. One of the reasons for this was that most Pākehā living in, say, the 4 main centres, were by this time unlikely to come into direct contact with Maori, and even in a provincial centre such as Hamilton, Maori appeared only to sell vegetables door to door and did not live in the town. Those few Europeans who visited a Maori community were very much aware that they were glimpsing a world quite different from their own. The disposition of such settlements, the provision of communal meeting, cooking and eating facilities, the styles of houses, the materials from which they were built, the nature of the activities that went on in and around them, the language that was spoken, the kind of food that was eaten and the manner in which it was prepared, all these features suggested to Europeans a distinctively Maori way of life and one that seemed indistinguishable from place to place. Traditional Maori clothing had gone out of general use by the 1850s, and much earlier in communities associated with whaling and trading and those close to European settlements, though it would still be donned, especially cloaks, for ceremonial occasions and cultural performances. As the European settler population had begun to swell in the 1840s, so European clothes, new and second-hand, had become widely available, along with blankets, which had the advantage of being usable as clothing and or bedding. These items were sold by travelling merchants and storekeepers who sometimes exploited the Maori market for excessive rewards, especially in places where whole communities had recently come into money from land sales or the trading of commodities. There was a simultaneous and continuing Maori demand from the same entrepreneurs for pipes, tobacco, axes, spades, cooking utensils, especially billies, camp ovens, kettles, buckets and knives, and for metals with which to make other tools. Generally in the 19th century, Maori settlements continued to be built around family and hapu membership, and they ranged in size from half a dozen households to several hundred. Each community was likely to have 5 kinds of building: whare mehana, or sleeping houses, kauta, or communal cookhouses, pataka, or storehouses, whata, or shelters for storing wood, for a long time the only source of fuel for cooking and heating, and, more often as the century drew near its close, wharepuni or community meeting houses. A whare mehana might shelter an immediate family or an extended one. It was common for children to live and sleep with members of the extended family who were not necessarily their birth parents. Such houses would rarely be used for cooking and eating, which would more commonly take place in community facilities. The size and style of these and other Maori constructions gradually changed with the increasing availability of European tools, garments, utensils and other materials. Houses progressively became larger and better ventilated, and chimneys and European-type fireplaces were being added in many districts from the 1870s. It was becoming common by the close of the century for rangatira families to live in well-built and well-endowed European-style houses. Wharepuni increased greatly in size to the kinds of dimensions that would become common in the 20th century. The incentive to build larger facilities was greatest where tribes had regular inter-hapu or intertribal meetings to sustain, such as Waikato with its Kingitanga Pokai or Loyalty Hui, and Tuhoi with its Ringatu Te Komarua or Holy Days, or those communities in Northland and Wairarapa who became closely involved in the Kotahitanga movement, which attempted to unify Maori politically. Observers noted in the 1870s and 1880s that large and well-catered functions were becoming an increasingly common feature of Maori life now that fighting was no longer available to provide an incentive and a focus for community effort. The larger and more lavish the hui or gathering, the more mana accrued to the host community. Prestige in Polynesian terms being measured by what was given away rather than by what was accumulated. And, of course, such occasions required reciprocation by guests, the custom of utu, or balanced exchange, being as important to the functioning of Maori society in the 19th century as it had been in the 18th. Another factor promoting the enlargement of buildings was the availability of pit-sawn timber and European tools. The latter aided construction on a bigger scale and the evolution of increasingly elaborate styles of carving, especially on the east coast of the North Island and in Te Arawa territory. A growing familiarity with European architecture also modified the styles of smaller buildings in some areas, even those where traditional building materials were still in use. Some dwellings, such as those in King Tawhiao's settlement at Whatiwhatihoi, had doors at the side, sheltered by verandas. In most districts, traditional building materials, ropo, muka, ponga, earth sods, bark, niko branches, continued to be used into the 1880s. Houses were likely to have wooden frames, usually of manuka or tree fern trunks, and wall material of reed or wood packed against them. Sod walls remained in favour in some South Island communities, partly because wood was not always available, and partly because they gave better insulation in a colder climate. There were other marked regional differences. Punga logs tended to be used vertically for house walls on the mainland and horizontally, a style known as waka waka, on the Chatham Islands. Roofs were thatched with reed, niko or tussock, or made from bark. Structures made from these materials were still visible in the early years of the 20th century, though by then their use was in decline. Generally, as pit-sawn timber and corrugated iron became available in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, Maori were quick to use them where they could afford to. House styles changed in the process. Those of important or wealthy Maori, the Taiaroa family at Tomutu on Banks Peninsula, for example, became indistinguishable externally from those of comparably wealthy Pākehā rural families. Other Maori opted for rectangular huts and cottages with fireplaces and chimneys and continued to use communal kauta for cooking and eating. Some Maori leading subsistence lives combined European and Maori building materials. Te Puea Herangi of Waikato, for example, used ponga walls and thatching for conventional cottages in her communities up to the 1930s. While people engaged in seasonal work or foraging activities, flax cutting, gum digging, mutton birding and pigeon trapping, for example, continued to build traditional shelters and campsites, These should not be mistaken for so-called substandard permanent housing. In Pākehā eyes, most Maori accommodation in the 19th and early 20th centuries was substandard. Indeed, the lack of toilet facilities, running water or ventilation, overcrowding in sleeping quarters, and unhygienic conditions for the preparation of food, all these features were to be characteristic of Maori communities and individual dwellings until the 1930s, and they contributed to the Maori vulnerability to communicable diseases. Maori housing, in European usage, was synonymous with poor housing. These features were the first to be criticised and then combated by Maori health authorities when they were appointed for the first time in the early 1900s. They were not self-evidently inimical to Maori lifestyles, however, and there was therefore little immediate incentive for communities to change them. Latrines tended to be built under the supervision of a visiting health officer and then abandoned when he left. But such conditions did contribute to the spread of tuberculosis, typhoid fever, dysentery and diarrheal and respiratory diseases, and generally made the outbreak of contagious illnesses more likely to affect whole families and communities. Inasmuch as sickness debilitated people or shortened their lives, then such conditions were a threat to the survival of Maori people, and in part the source of the declining population statistics. Once Maori leaders made this cause and effect connection, they fought hard to change such conditions. Some communities sought to anaesthetize themselves from health problems and from grief associated with resulting deaths by excessive use of alcohol, with the result that their members became even more susceptible to ill health and less capable of coping with the crises that illness brought. In this way, whole villages and hapu in some areas were prone to sink into sloughs of despondency from which it was difficult to emerge. Te Uira Te Hiuhiu, a Tuwharetoa woman who married into such a community in Waikato in 1913, was shocked. "There seemed to be no sense of direction," she wrote later. "Life just drifted by." Footnote. Te Uira Te Hiuhiu's shock, it should be noted, arose from the fact that such conditions were by no means universal. Some Maori communities, especially those with a sound economic base on the east coast of the North Island, in Hawke's Bay, in Tuwharetoa territory, and in parts of the South Island, were coping with their vicissitudes with determination and considerable success. Returning to the text. For a long time the official attitude to problems of Maori health and welfare was to ignore them. There were, in effect, two New Zealands at this time, the Pākehā one, served and serviced by national and local government administration systems, and Maori New Zealand, served by a native school system and little else, but ignored except when national or local government wanted to appropriate land, income, dog taxes for example, or manpower. Maori were unable to obtain housing finance until the 1930s. Maori owners were unable to borrow money for land development. Land taken from Maori for public works would not be returned when the public use was over. Few doctors saw Maori patients, hospitals rarely took them, and most did not want to. The Auckland health officer, in whose district the bulk of the Maori population lived, stated in 1911 that Maori health should be of concern to Europeans, but only because the unchecked spread of Maori diseases could lead eventually to Europeans contracting them. "As matters stand," he wrote, "the native race is a menace to the well-being of the European." Despite these fears of contamination, the Maori population was well insulated from non-Maori throughout the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. In 1900, 98% of Maori lived in rural communities that were so scattered as to cause not only geographic separation of Maori from Pākehā, but also Maori from other Maori. The major concentrations were north of Whangarei, in South Auckland, Waikato, the King Country, the Bay of Plenty, Inland Bay of Plenty, Central North Island, Rangitike, Whanganui and Taranaki. Families continued to live for the most part in kāinga or small villages with a hapu base, or in more isolated districts in individual family homes outside kāinga. The South Island Maori population, numbering only 1,400 in 1901 out of a national Maori total of 45,000, lived principally in half a dozen kaiks, kāinga in South Island dialect, close to but separate from European settlements in Canterbury, Otago and Westland, or in kāinga close to Blenheim, Picton, Nelson and Motueka at the top of the island, which had been colonised by North Island tribes. Life in such settlements tended to be oriented towards the family, community and hapu. On occasion, this orientation would extend to wider tribal units, especially when land matters were being discussed or disputed, or even to waka federations such as Tainui, Te Arawa or Matatua. The latter was especially likely when wider groupings such as the Kingitanga or Hahi Ringatu were involved, activating more extensive kinship networks and obligations. Effective leaders were kaumatua or family heads, while whole hapu would be spoken for at Waidahui by rangatira, who usually had a whakapapa claim to leadership, but whose acceptance depended also on retaining the confidence of their kaumatua. Major decision-making on community matters was centred on consensus-forming discussion among family heads on local marae. In the South Island, Kaika had established runanga or councils in which whole communities were likely to be involved and which would be chaired and spoken for by upoko runaka or community leaders. In rare cases such as Waikato, Maniapoto and Ngati Tuwharetoa, ariki or paramount chiefs would speak for federations of tribes, but more often tribal spokesmen would be rangatira dominant at a particular time or nominated by the rest of the tribe to represent them for a particular project. Only rarely were such spokespersons women. Male primogeniture was still the concept most often ratified by tikanga. Within these defined but flexible structures, communities organised their rounds of hui, tangihanga, funeral ceremonies, and church functions, arranged marriages to strengthen useful alliances among families and hapu, planned, constructed and maintained community facilities such as meeting houses and dining halls, dealt with local conflict and often resolved it, and discussed the perennial issues raised by prospects of land sales or public works in the vicinity of kāinga. When some Maori groups sought greater degrees of rangatiratanga or autonomy in the early years of the 21st century, it was not only because they believed such a provision was embedded in the Treaty of Waitangi, but also because such autonomy had been the norm for many Maori communities, even if their exercise of it had been the result of official indifference rather than deliberate government and local government policies. A few Maori groups were for a time spectacularly and successfully self-reliant, sustaining their members and protecting them from the effects of disease, alcohol and demoralization felt elsewhere. Te Whiti o Rongomai's community at Parihaka, with its largely Taranaki tribal base, was one such successful experiment. From the late 1880s it had its own slaughterhouse, bakery, bank and prison, and generated electricity for lighting. A similar quest for Maori independence, merging Western ideas and technology with Maori needs, was launched by the Tuhoi prophet Urua Kenana at Mongapohatu in the Urewera from 1907. Other pā, such as Papawai near Greytown, were not as well equipped technologically as Parihaka had been, but were able to nourish their inhabitants and provide lavish accommodation and hospitality for visitors, Maori and Pakeha. Some communities, like those in the South Island close to European centres of population and mingling with Pakeha in work and sport, were, by the beginning of the 20th century, almost indistinguishable in external appearance from a Pakeha village. Others, such as the settlements high up on the Whanganui River and the smaller Tuhoi villages in the Urewera, had changed very little in appearance since the wars of the 1860s. In these respects, as in others, Maori life was characterized by diversity. Footnote: the Urewera was the last Maori district to be penetrated by Europeans and European influences. For this reason it became a target for ethnologists such as Elsden Best. These men, most interested in manifestations of old-time Maori culture, tended to ignore or condemn the experiment in acculturation being conducted by Ruakenana. Returning to the text. Most Maori communities made a precarious living from mixed subsistence farming. The scale of Maori horticulture had diminished greatly from the great days of the 1840s and 1850s, when the Waikato, Hauraki, Arawa and Bay of Plenty tribes had been the country's major crop producers and exporters. Later in the century, with most of their good land bought or taken from them, denied access to the government assistance available to Pākehā farmers for land development, Maori in most parts of the country could barely produce sufficient meat, grain, vegetables and fruit to feed themselves. In some places, such as the Urewera, communities lived close to starvation. In other areas, such as Maketu in the Bay of Plenty, Maori labour and produce were plentiful. Paritu, a village on the shore of Wharikawa estuary on the Coromandel Peninsula, was not untypical of turn-of-the-century Maori communities, though the people were of mixed tribal origins. Some Arawa refugees from the catastrophic Tarawera eruption of 1886, others from East Coast and Bay of Plenty tribes who had moved to the district for casual work in the forests, gold mines and gum fields, and still others Tainui people with links to those who had been tangata whenua in the region until scared away by Ngāpuhi raids at the time of the Musket Wars. Footnote: Mount Tarawera erupted on the night of the 10th of June 1886. At least 147 Maori and 6 Pākehā died. The villages of Te Wairoa, Moura and Te Ariki were buried, and the fabled pink and white terraces destroyed. Returning to the text. They grew extensive fruit and vegetable crops, kept some animals for milk and meat and chickens for eggs, and foraged for fish and shellfish, which were plentiful in and outside the estuary. When they needed cash for such groceries as flour, sugar and tea, they dug for kauri gum, or took casual work with the timber company Leyland O'Brien, which was logging the Wharikawa watershed, or the Luck at Last mine, which was extracting gold nearby. They bartered homegrown produce with one another. Community discussion took place around a house and kauta that served as a marae, and unusually they had a church for ringatu services. In 1907 a native school opened at Opoutere, a short distance away. Maori was the first language in the homes, and Maori values and mores prevailed. Everyone involved in this community remembered it as a safe and satisfying place in which to grow up. There was little cash about and few luxuries, but the necessities of life were well provided. At Paritu and elsewhere, when families were unable to be self-sufficient, Maori labourers would rely increasingly on income from seasonal work created by the expanding European rural economy. It was common for Maori gangs in country districts to do fencing, drain laying, shearing, crop harvesting, flax cutting and processing, and scrub cutting or labouring on road and railways public works. Often whole families or hapu would specialise in specific jobs. In many areas such work was available from farmers or local bodies adjacent to hapu settlements. Where individuals left their own kāinga in search of such work, they tended to settle in other rural Maori communities, adopting the identity and kawa, protocols, of their hosts, or of the family or hapu into which they married. This served to mitigate the appearance and effects of detribalization, which, while underway from the early years of the 20th century, did not become apparent for another generation as a result of migration for work and the demise of some small communities through depopulation. A commitment to Maori values remained strong at this time, despite the fact that most Maori had nominally converted to Christianity. the largest number to the Anglican Church, the remainder to Roman Catholicism, Methodism, Mormonism and Presbyterianism, in that order. Mana and tapu were still decisive factors determining who led Maori communities, who deserved respect and why. The principle of utu still determined what was done or not done. It was still widely believed that hara, or faults in a Maori sense, created chinks in an individual's personal tapu, and that this in turn left the individual vulnerable to makutu, black magic, illness, madness or death. Most instances of actual sickness or death were explained in these terms. Despite a sincere commitment to Christian values, Tohunga continued to perform Maori karakia or religious rites and to practice folk medicine, sometimes with disastrous results when dealing with such Pākehā illnesses as measles or influenza. Immersion in water was a common feature of Maori ritual, which, in the case of influenza, could lead to pneumonia. In some instances, Maori were Christian in some contexts, a wedding or a church service, say, and Maori in others, such as combating makutu or performing rituals prior to planting crops or felling trees. In the latter, many Maori saw nothing incongruous about invoking the old gods, Rongo and Tāne, alongside Te Atua, the god of the Bible. Some practiced Christian and Maori religion simultaneously. Many Waikato Maori adherents of the Kingitanga, for example, were followers of Pai Marire and Baptist Methodists. This was not regarded as contradictory. Maori had come to view life in terms of taha Maori and taha Pākehā, the Maori and the Pākehā sides of themselves, and of life in general. The focal point of Maori communal life was the hui. People who could no longer fight one another came together to compete in other ways, to surpass the hospitality of their previous hosts, to issue oratorical challenges and display astonishing feats of memory in the recitation of genealogy and tradition, to debate other people's versions of genealogy and tradition, to display prowess in haka, action song, wielding the taiaha, and handling canoes, to celebrate who and what they were. Hui were an established tradition throughout the country. Ngai Tahu in the South Island kept their identity alive by meeting regularly and debating how to prosecute their claim against the Crown for unkept promises made at the time of land purchases. The people of Whanganui and the King Country met to debate native land court questions, ownership and guardianship of the Whanganui River, where the main trunk railway line should be allowed to go, where roads should be laid, and the extent to which Maori communities should be relocated to take advantage of these new arteries of communication. Ngāti Kahungunu Hapu met to discuss the repudiation movement which challenged Pākehā land purchases in Hawke's Bay. Tūhoi met to consider whether they ought to allow surveying and gold prospecting in the Urewera. Tainui tribes came together interminably to discuss new proposals for political representation, the mana of the Kingitanga, and the pros and cons associated with the sale and lease of land. In a sense, though, these were excuses for hui, not the causes. Essentially, hui were occasions on which hapu and iwi could come together to renew old relationships, to sing, to dance, to tell stories, to listen to and argue in lengthy whai kōrero. Increasingly in the later years of the 19th century, these occasions were becoming intertribal ventures, as leaders and followers felt impelled to address the questions of the day. By the 1890s, a feeling was coalescing that some form of Maori, rather than specifically tribal political activity, should be attempted to promote common Maori causes, particularly in dealings with the National Parliament, whose Maori representatives had, on the whole, made little impact. All such hui were conducted according to Maori kawa, though the details of such etiquette varied slightly from tribe to tribe and district to district. In some places the hosts spoke first during formal welcomes, in others the visitors. In some, hosts and visitors alternated speakers. In others they followed one another until each group finished separately. Most tribes forbade women speaking on the marae. though some, such as those on the East Coast, tolerated it. All these customs had evolved and become fixed practices in the pre-1840 years, when tribes were largely separated from one another. The general structure of rituals of encounter was recognizable throughout the country, however. Successive waves of visitors would be called onto the host marae. They would pause to tangi for the dead of both sides. They would be greeted by speeches and waiata that asserted the identity of the hosts, and they would reply in kind with speeches and songs of their own. Then they would hongi or press noses with the hosts to indicate that the tapu of visitor status had been removed through the ritual of welcome, and then they would be fed. The hui ritual that remained most pervasive, and which some referred to as the heartbeat of Maori culture, was the tangihanga, or mourning ceremony for the dead. The practice was modified slightly over the years to incorporate some Christian elements and to meet public health requirements. But the fundamental sequence and purpose changed little from the 19th to the 20th centuries. When a person died, the body was laid out on the marae of the family or hapu. It was exposed to view, at first on mats, later in open coffins, for days while mourners came to pay respects and to comfort the bereaved. The tūpāpaku, or corpse, was addressed in oratory and lament, as were the spirits of the relatives who had predeceased him or her. Fine mats, cloaks and heirlooms would also be on display to demonstrate the mana of the hapu and to symbolically warm and protect the deceased. From the 1890s, photographs were incorporated into the ritual to recall the presence of the dead. At about the same time, portraits began to be placed on meeting house walls, an extension of the concept which regarded such houses as representations of the genealogies of the hapu. This shift was also a striking example of the Maori genius for taking what was useful from Western technology to strengthen Maori concepts and practices. The duration of tangi varied. Until the end of the 19th century, they could go on for weeks, even months if the deceased was sufficiently important. The last one of considerable length was for King Tawhiao in 1894, which lasted nearly 2 months. Public health legislation early in the 20th century restricted the mourning time, and it became customary to hold ceremonies within a week. Improving systems of transport and communications also reduced the need to display the body for longer periods. The ceremonies ended with a Christian funeral service, usually conducted by Maori clergymen, of whom the Anglican Church in particular had an ample supply. The Catholics, by contrast, did not ordain a Maori priest until 1944, although the Church had had Maori seminarians, one of whom was sent to study in Rome as early as the 1850s. And a European-type burial service in the course of which many of the deceased's personal possessions were likely to be interred with the body. A year or more later, another ceremony would be held to unveil the headstone, and this fulfilled some of the functions of the pre-European hahunga, or exhumation rite, which ended the period of mourning. Late in the 19th century, Maori women began to adopt the Victorian mourning costume of black clothes for tangi, and the practice continued long after Pākehā New Zealanders had dropped the custom. Although the proceedings of the country's parliament were remote from the daily lives of most Maori, some legislation had affected them intimately. Since European settlers had been granted so-called responsible government by the British Parliament in 1852, one of the most difficult issues of governance had been devising ways to ascertain ownership of communally held Maori land, and hence whom to deal with in sales transactions. The problem increased as the European population increased. Inevitably, too, Pākehā buyers wanted the best agricultural and pastoral land available. In an attempt to accelerate such transactions, the Native Land Court was established in 1865, its functions superseding those of the earlier Native Land Purchase Department. The court held sittings presided over by a judge to investigate claims to land based on ancestral occupation, right of conquest, and continuity of use and occupation, to rule on the validity of such claims, and to record the names of successful claimants as owners. Although one of the main reasons for establishing the court's procedures was to facilitate the transfer of Maori land to Pākehā ownership, Maori themselves often displayed a considerable willingness to bring land to the court and to offer it for sale. The reasons were complex. In some cases, would-be sellers simply wanted money with which to purchase commodities or expand their capacity to offer hospitality, or the land concerned was unwanted. But in many other cases, court sittings and sales were initiated by Maori to prove the validity of their claims over those of rivals. The sittings became, in other words, another forum for the inter-hapu and tribal rivalries that had always characterized Maori life. In some instances, spurious claimants launched proceedings simply to annoy an opponent, or to take utu for some wrong inflicted on them previously. In this manner, court sittings became an extension of, or at least a sequel to, tribal confrontation. The Native Land Court also became a major institution in Maori life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some elderly people, repositories of tribal traditions, became almost professional court-goers as claim clashed with counterclaim. More important, perhaps, the court minutes carefully recorded most of the testimony presented, and thus became the country's first archive of Maori oral history on a large scale. Families often accompanied elders to sittings in the towns nearest the lands under discussion and camped close to the court. Thus the hearings also became occasions for reunions and hui. When the National Parliament had instituted 4 Maori seats in 1867, one of the factors that made this measure acceptable to Pākehā MPs was that it gave the North Island a more favourable balance of seats in relation to the South Island, where gold rushes had ensured a population explosion and consequent disproportionate increase in the number of seats there. In some respects, this was an enlightened move, giving adult Maori males universal suffrage 12 years ahead of Pākehā men, and making New Zealand the first neo-European country in the world to give votes to its indigenous population. It would be another 95 years before Australia did the same. But had those seats been allocated on a population basis, as the non-Maori ones were, Maori would have had 14 or 15. Initially, the new electorates were established as temporary ones, reflecting the widely held belief that the Maori population would barely survive the 19th century. But they were made permanent in 1876, and towards the close of the 20th century, increased in number on, at last, the basis of population. Early Maori MPs were kupapa and tended to be the nominees and protégés of the powerful Minister of Native Affairs, Donald Maclean. They had at first little contact with the flax roots of Maori communities, where national issues, other than the disposal of Maori land, were not a major concern. But by the close of the 19th century, such members as James Carroll, Wee Peri, Hori Kere Taiaroa, Tami Parata, Hireni Taifanga, and Honi Heki Ngāpua had begun to surprise and then annoy successive governments by opposing Maori legislation of the day as being not in the interests of Maori constituents. Until the admission of James Carroll into the Liberal government's cabinet in 1892, Maori members were not effective in changing the course of such legislation. But Maori representation did serve as a Trojan horse to introduce both a Maori presence and Maori considerations into the legislature, and eventually those considerations became part of legislation when more able and more sophisticated members took the seats. By the close of the 19th century, however, the prognosis for the Maori population and culture did not seem favourable. Numbers were falling, as was the Maori percentage of the population as a whole. From constituting 50% of the nation's citizens in 1860, they made up only 10% by 1891. Their remaining lands constituted only 17% of the country, and a great deal of this was marginal and, in effect, useless. While some communities thrived healthily on their own holdings, most notably those on the east coast and in parts of the Bay of Plenty, others were demoralized and handicapped by malnutrition, alcohol, and disease. It was an awareness of these negative factors that led Archdeacon Walsh to write of the passing of the Maori in the Transactions and Proceedings of the New Zealand Institute. He summarized, "The Maori has lost heart and abandoned hope, as it has already been observed in the case of the individual, when once the vital force has fallen below a certain point, he died from the sheer want of an effort to live. So it is with the race. It is sick unto death, and it is already potentially dead." It was in an attempt to rectify those same conditions that a number of Maori leaders from a new generation decided to experiment with new forms of political and social activity. And the patient did not die, as Archdeacon Walsh predicted. He got up from his bed and walked.